code. And then I would get to this. All right. Again, hopefully everybody's seeing my PowerPoint, my slides.
Yes.
So we want to thank everyone again to who chosen to be here with us this morning for our final episode for season 7 of Environmental Fridays. It is personal. On this slide, you could see our link, our website address there, and also on the right bottom corner, there is a QR code that could get you to our website. We also have presence on Facebook. All you have to do is go to Google and put environmental Facebook group, environmental Facebook, environmental Friday, sorry, Facebook. And the very first hits that come up would lead you there. And so this is a group that we have on Facebook in which we try to, have an active and dynamic interaction about environmental issues above and beyond what we do here on Fridays. So we encourage all of you, if you haven't joined, to join. Also, playlist. I was just mentioning that the playlist that we have is a resource that we've now developed. Clearly over 100, probably 150 or more videos on YouTube. Again, easy way to do this is to go to Google and just put Environmental Fridays YouTube. And the first hits that you will get would be our playlist. This playlist, this QR code is for season 7, the QR code that's on the screen now. And so that would take you to season 7's playlist, all of our videos. And probably by the end of today, we'll have Stephanie's episode online as well. So just want to give a shout out and a thank you as we are at the last episode. We have a number of really great topics and speakers, as you could see here, from lots of different points of view, lots of different career experiences. And so we are thankful to each and every one of our guest speakers. This is a promote for our January episode. So again, this is our last for this year. We start off in January 10, and these are the 4 speakers we have for our January. This will be season 8, beginning of season 8 here. And you could see again, we have a nice variety of topics. We have a science journalist leading off. Then we'll talk about climate change and its effect on health and medicine, the environmental impact of the Chevron decision, and especially with a new administration coming in here in January, that could be a very interesting topic dealing with the environmental laws and priorities of this administration. And Sahara dust, sometimes we don't really get the full impact here up in Michigan, but it does affect us too. There have been reports of it coming this far, but I know, for example, in Florida, um, it is something that is experienced, Florida, the Caribbean, and so on. So these are our lead-off topics for next season. So at this point, I'd like to introduce Melanie Stefanovic. Not sure, it's probably just within the last 3 months or so, we've gotten to know each other and we are knowing each other more and more, which is a pretty exciting thing. She has a lot of really cool experience in something called nature schools. And so I've already given her notice that she will also be requested to be a guest speaker to tell us all about that. So in particular, Dr. Melanie Stefanovic co-founded and leads a nature school in Palm Beach County. It's called a Cocoa Plum Nature School. And it's an elementary school and it was established in 2020. She has over 2 decades of experience in education and school leadership. She has advanced degrees in leadership, educational, and elementary education from Florida Atlantic University, from Northwestern University, and she also did a bachelor's here close to me at the University of Notre Dame in psychology and English. Where are you originally from, Melanie?
Utah. I grew up in Utah.
Oh, Utah. You've made the rounds.
Yeah. No islands yet, but yeah.
Okay. So her research interests include culturally responsive leadership and inclusion in native schools. She's a resident of Delray Beach. I've never been to that beach. I'm assuming it's a really nice beach there. Is it touristy or is it still got?
More so. It was quiet a few years ago when I moved here, and it's getting a little busier now.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
She cherishes outdoor adventures with her family and proudly serves on the city's Green Implementation Advancement Board. So it's great to meet you and continue to work alongside you in this area of increasing awareness about our responsibilities in and for the environment. So Melanie, it's your turn to introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am so happy to be here, and thank you for that introduction. And I have the honor of introducing Dr. Steffanie Munguia. And did I pronounce that right? I know we practiced earlier. Okay, thank you. As Dr. Steffanie Munguia is an experienced Latina environmental advocate and conservation professional. She works across the hemisphere to enhance marginalized community engagement in the environmental movement. Steffanie comes from FIU, Florida International University. We're neighbors. It's so wonderful. And her dissertation, she studied the implementation of the Ramsar Convention on wetlands in the coastal Caribbean through political, economic, and social lenses, with an aim to understand the social and ecological decision-making processes. She recently was the student engagement director for Citizens Climate, and has just, I think maybe this week or the last couple of weeks, moved on from that role. So congratulations. Dr. Steffanie Munguia is now the avian conservation trailblazer at Zoo Miami, the first ever, and going to make a real impact there, and the important work that Zoo Miami does, and now bringing it to birds, something so important, especially in South Florida and in this region where migration is continually being impacted by our changing climate. So congratulations on your new role. And I am so excited to be here in discussion with you today. Welcome.
Well, thank you so much, Melody. And thank you, Desmond, for providing this space. I'm really excited to be here with you this morning in, as Melanie just said, my first week on the job. So I apologize for some things appearing to be a little bit messier, but I'm still trying to figure out how to talk about this transition and where exactly I am in my career, because I'm not in the same place I was just 6 days ago. So I appreciate the patience with that, but very excited to perhaps bring a slightly different topic to the forefront of the conversations that we have here on Environmental Fridays, and speak a little bit more specifically about what career development in environmental topics can look like. And certainly, as I always do, to emphasize that the linear career path, I won't call it a myth. I think some people do still have it, but it's certainly not the only thing one can aspire to. So For those of you who are trying to figure out how you turn this into a career, I hope that today's talk will give you some useful pointers, and also encourage you to maybe think creatively about how you want your career to look and feel across time. So a little bit of a primer about me and my journey. So in the bottom left, the pictures kind of go ascending into the current day. But in the bottom left, that's me when I was younger with my parents in Puerto Rico. I'm originally from Puerto Rico, so that's us in El Yunque National Forest. And I have many fond memories as a kid. I was very fortunate that my parents were wonderfully supportive of outdoor interests, and actually some of my very first outdoor adventures included my dad doing some field work and photography for herpetological outings, so reptile and amphibian outings in El Yunque, and my mom strapping me as an infant into the little baby carrier and tagging along for the ride. So I have really, really powerful memories of my time there. And even though I left Puerto Rico we left Puerto Rico when I was less than 2 years old, we still go back frequently, and it still very much feels like home. And in many ways, it has inspired the trajectory of the person I have become over the years. And really my focus on giving back to Latin American and Caribbean studies comes from that background. As I got older, I became more and more infatuated with wildlife, and at one point essentially was advised that if I wanted to work with wildlife, the best path forward might be to become a veterinarian, because if you're obsessed with birds, the only thing that one can do with birds apparently and earn a living is become a veterinarian. I'm very happy to say that is not entirely true. There are many more options out there for you, but I became very interested in sort of clinical experiences, working with wildlife rehabilitation and rescue. And that really carried me through my middle and high school years. I got much more engaged in that sort of direct, up close and personal, working directly with wildlife to conserve them by stepping in to help them when they encounter trouble, generally human caused trouble, in case of like collisions with buildings or cars, for example, are really common for many birds of prey. So I entered undergrad at the University of South Florida in Tampa. I didn't go too far for my undergraduate degree. I stayed pretty close to home, thinking that I was going to become a veterinarian. And one of the things that they advise you to do if you are interested in going to vet school, on top of getting clinical experience, they do also advise you to get research experience. So in my first semester on campus, I started seeking out research opportunities and was very fortunate to find a few options in different ecological labs on campus where I was able to volunteer and get some firsthand experience and exposure. And the summer after my freshman year, I participated in a National Science Foundation research experience for undergrads, or REU, that took me to Kansas. Definitely not the place I expected to end up. My parents were very concerned. Our entire exposure to Kansas was mostly The Wizard of Oz, and my mother checked in every single day to make sure a tornado hadn't taken me away to a fairy tale land. Surprisingly, I happen to be in the only part of Kansas that does not have a very high tornado risk, because it actually is not as flat as one might expect. It's called the Flint Hills region. And while I was out in Kansas, I was studying grasshopper sparrows, which are a very small grassland songbird that's their population is declining very precipitously. And I was studying how they behaved and their breeding success under different management conditions. So whether they were trying to breed on lands that had cattle grazing versus bison grazing, and if it was being burned on a regular basis or had longer intervals between burns. Why am I sharing this particular research with you? Well, at the end of that summer, we had some pretty interesting findings that indicated that a particular management combination of grazing and burning was supporting much more successful breeding. So I spoke to my research supervisor at the time and I said, okay, well, we know that this is the management protocol that we should be endorsing. How do we advocate with decision makers, with farmers, to make sure that this is the management style that is subsidized or supported by government entities? And she said, well, that's not really your job. You're a scientist. You are just going to collect the data. You're going to publish it. Somebody else will deal with like how we actually apply that to make a difference. And throughout my years of schooling, all that time, I had gotten very involved with different environmental advocacy organizations. So that just didn't sit right with me. And it made me think that maybe I needed to rethink this idea about a career in research, because I really wanted something that was going to be a little bit closer to a career in advocacy. So when I decided to return to the University of South Florida to finish my bachelor's in biology, I also added a bachelor's in environmental policy. And that led me down a very deep rabbit hole of policy. So I'm happy to nerd out about either science or policy with you. And I got very involved in lobbying and meeting with members of Congress and policy analysis and things like that. And that's really what I focused my master's on. And to some extent, my dissertation as well, which I'll speak about in just a moment. But there was one kind of common thread that kept pushing me through this, like, oh, why? And it was that I continually have been obsessed with birds. So one of the things that I really wanted to make sure I did as I entered my PhD program was find some way to keep that connection alive. And I was very fortunate to find that here in Miami-Dade County in Florida, we do have a bird banding station, actually the longest running migratory songbird banding station in the southern part of the Atlantic Flyway. So we've been banding for about 20 years out there, and I've been very fortunate to be a part of the last 4 years of the station's history. And to be totally honest, getting to volunteer with bird banding is what got me through my PhD, because a dissertation is challenging. I'll talk about that a little bit more throughout the rest of this talk. But having that really visceral connectivity to my why, to the thing that I was working so hard to protect, was really critically important. So what exactly was I doing when I wasn't out in the field with birds? As I said, I was working on my dissertation at Florida International University, and as Melanie already pointed out, it was on Ramsar implementation in the Caribbean. And I came at this from a few different perspectives. One of them looking at policy and management, so applying everything that I had learned from my environmental policy degree in undergrad and my master's in international environmental policy to understand how institutions and policies govern management decisions on the ground. So these are the things that people write down on paper that are supposed to dictate how wetlands are going to be managed. And I should mention that these coastal wetlands in the Caribbean are really critical stopover sites for migrating birds, which was another way that I connected this work to my bird work and also to my climate work, because they're deeply impacted by climate change. That'll be a theme. We'll come back to that in a moment. And then the second lens that I looked at this was financing conservation, because as many of us know, conservation costs money. We can't get away from that fact. And unfortunately, one of the main reasons that decision makers often cite when saying that they can't pursue a conservation measure is that they can't afford to. So I looked at whether or not carbon markets would be a suitable avenue for funding conservation in these coastal wetland sites. And lastly, I also know that no matter what you put down on paper and no matter how much cash you throw at a problem, if the community doesn't want it, it's not going to happen. So I looked into conducting a social network analysis at a couple of different sites in the Caribbean to look at how community members perceive site management decisions and whether there was equity and inclusivity in the decision-making process. So taken together, this gave us a much more robust picture of what was happening in the Caribbean. And the very long story short version of our findings, there are definitely institutional challenges in managing wetlands. They are a strange system. They are neither land nor water. So a lot of governments haven't quite figured out how to manage that, like where that fits in their hierarchy. I looked at this specifically in the context of Trinidad and the Caroni Swamp, which is a critically important roosting and breeding site for scarlet ibis. And there is a lot of confusion about who is supposed to do what in that wetland. And then on the financing conservation side, there's definitely a great deal of opportunity there, but time is running out because so much of the coastal Caribbean is being developed so rapidly that there's very little natural sites to continue to protect in some places. And on the social network side, as probably many of you have felt, if you have tried to get involved with community advocacy, a lot of community members feel like they were not engaged in decision-making processes, like they don't have a voice, even though they're the ones who are most directly being impacted by decisions, and this leads to major breakdowns in communication and effectiveness of what they are trying to achieve with conservation. All right, so that's a little bit about what I was doing. And as I kind of went through this graduate school process, I came to realize that there was a real problem with the way, at least in the United States, but I imagine in a lot of other cultural contexts as well, graduate school advisors, professors tend to encourage students, I heard this a lot myself, to essentially press pause on the rest of your life, or they expect you to press pause on the rest of your life and just focus on your studies. And it is critically important. You are a student. That is should be one of your priorities, especially if you want to finish your degree in a timely fashion. But what I have found on the flip side of that, and from watching my colleagues who graduated with me and kind of followed and ascribed to that wisdom, is that if you do that entirely, when you graduate, it's actually not super beneficial to your career unless you had a very specific type of research project that enabled you to gain more practical career skills. So I kind of approached grad school in a really different way. And I told my advisor from the beginning, like, I have these other commitments. I have these other ways that I show up in the community. And I'm not planning to stop doing those things just because I'm in grad school. I understand it'll be some additional work, but I think that they are deeply connected to the work I do in my research. And for that reason, I want to keep those relationships and sustain that work while I do this. So today I'm going to talk a little bit about how to do that without overextending oneself and why it's so important. So we're going to begin with why the voices of students are so desperately needed in the environmental movement, and why I really encourage any of you who are students or work with students to make sure that your students don't just disappear for 4 or 6 or 8 years while they're getting their studies done. What to do and not to do to maximize your student impact, and how to start engaging right away in the issues that you're most passionate about. So I'm speaking to this from a background of over 20 years of student engagement. I actually started creating student engagement programming when I was in middle school, mostly because I realized that there was a lack of that in my own community. I didn't have the benefit of having a nature school that I was attending or in my county. So I realized there was a real need for a space and community for people, so that people like me who enjoyed being outdoors and enjoyed being involved in invasive species removal didn't feel quite so alone and knew exactly where to bring that energy to. As I continued to do that, I started to realize just how important this was as I began to be exposed to so many of my mentors, and kind of understanding that many of the people who were creating these opportunities for me were quite a bit older, like not just the generation before me, but maybe 2 generations before me. And it made me realize there was this big gap that was coming, at least here in the United States, where we had many accomplished environmental professionals who were going to retire and didn't have the next generation underneath them really trained and ready to take their space. And that really made me invest more time in training that next generation, so that when those retirements would come up, we would have people who are just as competent and knowledgeable and skilled who'd be able to take up that mantle. The other thing that I realized as I was doing this, and I don't think, as a child, I fully understood how important this was for me, but I was pretty much the only Latina in most of those spaces. I stood out in every single meeting I ever attended because I was at least 40 years younger than everyone else in the room, and also one of the only people who spoke a language other than English. And it didn't really click when I was younger just how significant that was, but as I continue to work on student engagement, I realized just how important this is to engage a more diverse generation as well, and to make sure that we're building an environmental movement that's representative of a variety of different interests, not just how the environmental movement has been conceptualized for many years, and making that much more intentionally intersectional, and making sure that people realize that when we are fighting for environmental resources, we're also fighting for things like equity and social justice and racial justice, and that those things are all intertwined. So I really believe that universities fill a critical gap in how we train environmental professionals. I think for a lot of folks, sort of the pathway is that you were really focusing on education. We focus really deeply on building this kind of core skill set in elementary and middle school, and like this core knowledge base that you then build on. And then in high school, many of us are expected to do a lot of community service. So that's where we start to elevate our education into engagement and becoming more involved in our community in these issues in a much more tangible and practical way. For some people, this is when empowerment also starts to happen. I know for me, that definitely was the case because I was developing curriculum when I was in high school, and it made me feel much more knowledgeable about the things I cared about. For some people, it might come later in undergrad. Either way, that's a really important piece. And then somehow those three things, those three kind of small experiences are supposed to spit out an environmental professional at the end of this, supposedly. But obviously we can't learn everything we need to learn about the environment and about what the needs are in a classroom. So universities have this really unique ability that they're not just classrooms. Universities are deeply connected with communities. They have these great institutional relationships with other entities. There's a unique opportunity in universities to make sure that students are connecting what they're learning in the classroom to the impact they can have in the field and what that impact actually looks like, which is why it's so important that students don't just take a step back and stop engaging for those years that they're studying. So if we do take that step back, we're missing out on a huge opportunity because we are all buying into this paradigm that we're supposed to pause, that we're supposed to just focus on our studies. And not only is that detrimental to our own career development, but it's detrimental to the movement at large because students bring a remarkable energy. I've seen this all the time throughout my work over the years, that having a student in a meeting with a member of Congress or in a meeting with an institutional partner or out in the field with you brings a great amount of creativity and dynamism into the conversation. So there are a lot of reasons why students are needed at the table. For graduate students especially, there's a great deal of research competencies that come with surviving grad school. Universities themselves are huge treasure troves of resources. You gain project and task management skills, especially for grad students, if you are working with field assistants, if you are writing grants and having to manage how those funds are spent. You're gaining communication skills in all of your classes when you're giving presentations, of course, when you actually are defending your thesis or your dissertation. You have a unique access to researchers. And while I often say we do know what is needed to solve most of our environmental crises, we also need researchers who will continue to study what we think these solutions are and if they're actually working. So universities have those researchers, and connecting those researchers to actual projects in the field is critically important. I certainly have seen that in the context of my bird banding work as well. So we have a lot of people who want to handle birds and know how to handle them and know how to study them, and not so many people who know how to ask good research questions and publish about them so that the broader community learns about it. You also have fundable work. For students who are interested in getting out in the field, often our interests align really well with what an environmental organization in your community might be looking for. And I've seen many students who get grants from local environmental nonprofits or even from tribal communities who are looking for somebody to bring those research competencies into the field and help them study these things they're so passionate about. And many, many more superpowers. So again, yet another reason that students should stay engaged while they're studying. So now I want to transition into sharing a few tips that I found useful while I was going through school of what one can do to really maximize that impact while you're studying without necessarily sacrificing your academic achievement. So the first thing that I really would love to emphasize is that workshops are incredibly valuable. All throughout my studies, being able to attend workshops with professionals who were actually working in the field were so valuable to me to connect the sort of technical skill that I was learning in the classroom to what that work would actually look like as it developed into a career. And it's also a good way to get a sneak peek of whether or not you're going to enjoy doing that job in the field. So whether you're a student or you work with students, I really encourage you to seek out these opportunities and encourage students to take the additional time. Sometimes that might mean committing your spring break to attending a workshop in the field or giving up a weekend or two to go to one of these workshops. But those are incredibly transformative and useful experiences. And one thing I really suggest is keeping an eye on job descriptions that you think sound really appealing, and you read them and you kind of immediately feel like, oh, that's what I want to do for the rest of my life. It will also include a list of skill sets that they expect you to have, and you can find workshops to fill in those skills that you aren't likely to gain from your program. So for example, one thing I would see often on job descriptions that I enjoyed were facilitation or conflict resolution skills on job descriptions. And I was in a earth science and biology and ecology program. They weren't going to teach me facilitation or conflict resolution. I had to go out and look for that. So those workshops were really helpful for that. I also definitely recommend looking into conferences and professional societies, and not just for the purposes of going and presenting your work, which is definitely important, but also for the purposes of getting to know the community of practice that you'll be engaging with for a long time. Actually, this is what helped me to define my dissertation interest. Was I had been to several different conferences, and I attended a conference of the Society of Wetland Scientists at the end of my undergraduate term. And I was just sitting at a social hour talking to some people, and like about 10 minutes into the conversation, I just found myself thinking, like, these are my people. These are the kind of people that I want to work with. The way that they were talking about the research that they do, the way that they were talking about how they engage communities in that work, really clicked for me. It was the moment that I felt like, wow, this is the type of work I want to spend the rest of my life doing, and these are the people I want to be doing it with. So that's a really powerful experience when you do find your community. In addition, these professional societies often have grants for students. They help you to share your research ideas and get feedback and build your reputation in the community that you'll be working with. And I think the biggest thing to keep in mind is that once you find that society that you're really connected to, it's incredibly powerful if you just keep showing up. I've gone to almost every meeting of the Society of Wetland Scientists since that first one in 2016, have become very well connected and embedded in the leadership of that group, and it has been hugely helpful for my professional development. Now, the other thing I spent a lot of time doing was engaging with nonprofits. As I mentioned, I got involved with environmental advocacy groups when I was very young, and this was something that I was not willing to compromise as I entered grad school. And part of that is because I had already come to realize that these advisory councils and boards were spaces where I had the opportunity to shape some of these organizations that I most enjoyed thinking about working with someday. So if you really like an organization, like their work portfolio, but there's something about the organizational culture that worries you, or that you think, I would rather that they focused on this, or that they had a strategic shift. You know who sets strategy for that organization? Their board. So if you can get onto their board, and you can bring your expertise that is so relevant to their work that can be really valued, you can help to create the change that is needed for you to one day be able to lead in that organization as a staffer. That said, I don't think that it's helpful to work with every single nonprofit organization out there who might want you, because they're all going to want you. They're all very excited about having young people, people with diverse backgrounds on their boards, people with university connections on their boards. But ultimately, as a student, you do have these other commitments. So you have to be very strategic and choose those places to focus your energy and time that are going to support your career development long term. So I serve on the board of the National Audubon Society, which has been deeply connected to my bird work, and also to my work kind of across the hemisphere with engaging communities in conservation. That's very aligned with their mission and with my personal mission. And similarly, I've been very involved with the National Parks Conservation Association, because those protected areas are the framework that I kind of used throughout my research, my dissertation research, to understand how do we tell stories about these natural spaces, and how do we ensure that they're connecting and resonating with diverse communities. So be really strategic about where you invest your time, because it is a time commitment. The other thing that I really enjoyed was getting involved in community engaged research, and working with students who were my mentees and getting them involved in things like community and citizen science. These are great ways to practice your communication skills with diverse audiences. At the bird banding station, we have school groups, Girl Scout troops that come out on a regular basis, and we have to talk to them about why we're putting little pieces of metal on bird legs. And it is surprisingly challenging to communicate that and make them understand why that's important. But it's a good challenge, and it really helped me to grow as a student and communicator. In addition, it can also be an opportunity to discover new passions and talents. And in the case of the person you see in the photograph here, this is one of my mentees, Jennifer, and she didn't think she wanted to do research at all. She wasn't necessarily super excited about birds. And I took her out to the banding station to shadow me one day. And immediately she was like, oh my gosh, I had no idea that this is what research could be. And that I could work with birds. I'm like, well, this is an actual legitimate career path, believe it or not. And it ended up becoming her master's thesis, was evaluating the data from that banding station. So it can help you to maybe narrow down your focus and find something you're really passionate about if you get involved with these community science projects. And I think this is the last one, but working is an option while you are in school. Your advisor will probably try to talk you out of it, and they probably a good call. But I actually worked full-time for the last 2 years of my dissertation. I was working full-time with Citizens Climate. It was a very specific combination of things. It was a remote job. I also took on consulting jobs, like short-term contracts, while I was doing my dissertation work. And specifically, I was selective. I took on contracts that were related to the research I was already doing, or in some way were going to facilitate relationship building that I knew was going to be needed. But it enabled me to try a bunch of different things out. One of the jobs that I took on when I was in my master's program was helping to coordinate a sustainable seafood business competition. Turned out, really, I'm not a business person, but I really loved getting to work with competitors from all different countries. I enjoyed the challenge of figuring out what time it was in Vanuatu so that I knew when to call these competitors and ask them about the status of their application. I love that kind of cross-cultural collaboration and interaction. And that ultimately ended up informing the cross-cultural research that I did in my dissertation as well. So I think having these kind of work experiences enable you to learn what you really love. And it also helps you to rule things out, which I always tell students is just as valuable. Because it's always better to figure that out before you start committing too much energy to going down a particular career path. It's also helpful to consider going perhaps a little bit off track to gain skills that you think are going to be needed. So like I said before, facilitation skills kept coming up in a lot of the job descriptions that I was seeing that I was interested in. And when I found the job at Citizens Climate, that was one of the things that I knew I would be doing a lot. I would be facilitating conversations, community building around the climate movement. And even though climate wasn't necessarily like a core interest of mine, like I have always been a bird person through and through, I knew that this was going to be a valuable opportunity to gain those skills. And it was still related to my previous work in student engagement. So the most important advice here, though, is to be smart about this. Not every project that you see out there, not every RFP, not every job that you see out there is going to be compatible. My work with Citizens Climate worked out because it was fully remote and very flexible hours. So I could actually set aside the time that I needed for my research, and they were very understanding and supportive. That's not the case with every job. So some general tips as you're considering doing this. I think it's really important to clearly articulate what your through line is. For me, for a really long time, that has been, of course, birds, but more broadly, it has been community-based conservation. So that really led me down all of these different paths, these different organizations that I was engaging with. And I always knew that that was kind of my North Star. Even if you are in a good financial situation and you have funding, it's really valuable to practice grant writing, applying to scholarships. Every single application I submitted helped me to tell my story more effectively and actually taught me things about myself that I maybe hadn't fully realized or hadn't brought to the surface of my mind yet. So it's really valuable practice. It's important to get really good at project and time management tools and techniques that work for you. You can't just go online and like pick the first thing that you see on there. The Pomodoro method works really well for some people, and I will tell you, it just does not work for me, but time blocking is incredible for me. I just put it on my calendar and I say, I'm going to work for an hour on this and I will get it done. So you just have to try different things out and get good at that. And school is a really great time to gain that skill rather than waiting until you're in the workplace and have deadlines and a boss breathing down your neck to figure out what works for you. At the same time, it's really important to treat your study time as sacred, especially if you are going to be remaining really engaged in these other spaces. You are a student first and foremost if you're doing this while you're studying. And it's important not to lose sight of that. So like I said, I spend a lot of time blocking specific hours of my days. And I told my supervisor, I told my workplace, like, I can't schedule meetings during these 3 hours on Tuesdays and Thursdays and Fridays because like I'm working, I'm dissertating at that time, don't bother me. And that was really important to helping me get across the finish line. It's really valuable to actually spend some time looking at your resume on a regular basis, not just when you start applying for jobs. I've been guilty of this too, but now I actually set time on my calendar every quarter to look at my resume and see where there are some gaps, and to compare those to job descriptions that I'm thinking might look interesting for my next career stage and figure out how I can fill those. And lastly, take plenty of advantage of the resources that you have access to as a student. And if you're a professor, make sure that your students know what these resources are. I know there are the general kind of university resources that every student gets told about, like you have the library, you have, obviously you have like the mental health clinics, you have all sorts of things that help you to really develop good, healthy practices for long-term in your life. But there's also other like less tangible resources, like the types of connections that university might have at other institutions in the community. Those are really valuable to learn more about and start engaging with. And this picture here on the side, I actually made a list of the 10 reasons why I was getting a PhD, because I was advised by a professor in my master's program that a PhD is hard and it's helpful to remind yourself why you're doing this. And I actually kept this little 10 reasons list on the wall next to my desk. So every time that I was just frustrated and banging my head on the table, I would just look at this list and remember why I had agreed to do this in the first place. It was really helpful. Sometimes I could just get back into it by the time I got to item 3, and sometimes I had to read all the way down to 10 and start all over again. But I definitely advise that, and anytime you're embarking on a difficult challenge. So for the last little bit of our time together, I want to just talk a little bit about how you can start engaging in advocacy. I realize we don't have a huge amount of time, so I'll try to go through this quickly. But one of the things I really enjoyed and got out of my time with Citizens Climate was this idea of transformational advocacy. And this comes from work by Dr. Harry Hahn and Sam Daly Harris. But essentially what they define is that when you're doing transformational advocacy, you'll see an organization that does this type of advocacy work focuses a lot on recruitment, but not just recruiting big numbers, but actually making them feel connected to each other and building community. So if you ever have seen an organization that just sends out like those push action alerts, but you've never met anybody else who volunteers at that organization and there aren't opportunities to come together, that's not an organization that's doing transformational advocacy. That's very transactional. They're just asking for your name on a list so they can send thousands of letters to a member of Congress. That's not empowering to you. It's literally just a numbers game. And nobody wants to feel like they're just a number. A transformational advocacy organization also invests in training volunteers to take action. So again, those push action alerts alone aren't training you in any way. They're just asking you for your name. Look for the organizations that are investing in you as an advocate and helping you to learn and gain these critical skills. And the last and really important piece is that they help you to transform. So they encourage these breakthroughs in your personal and political power. And that includes things like, asking you to take bigger and bigger actions. So maybe you start off with just putting your name down on a list, and then they'll ask you, would you help us to organize this community event? And then they'll ask you, well, you did a really great job on that community event. Would you help us to lead this training? And little by little, you kind of build up your skill set and start to realize, like, by the time that you reach the end of that ladder, which there is no end really, but by the time you reach the end of that training sequence, you look back and you can't believe how far you've come. That's a great transformational advocacy experience. Since we talk a lot in graduate school about publication, I like to talk about choosing co-authors for transformation. This is about coalition building. As researchers, we do this in universities a lot. We find these collaborators at other institutions who have skill sets. But as students, we also need to do this coalition building. We need to build this community of people that we see ourselves working with long term, and that help us to practice bringing people together while also giving us an outlet to build meaningful relationships with people. Graduate school in general can feel very isolating. So it's really important to nurture these relationships long term. And if you can find those people who are on kind of a similar journey to you and have these similar passions, it's a really transformational experience. And the last piece is to really own your power. You can connect your research and work to real world impacts. As a photo of me in a lobby meeting with a state assemblywoman. It helps you to hone your story about why your research is important, why you are important in this space. You get to network with other people who care just as much about that issue as well. And in some cases, at least for me, it has helped me to actually believe in government and have some faith in it. Skeptical faith, but I think right now, probably many of us need that more than ever, to really feel that constituents do have power. And the most important way that we actually wield that power is by owning it and using it, and actually holding people accountable. The most important takeaway from all of this, though, is that every single path should lead back to your why. All of these different experiences that I engage with throughout school led back to that little girl sitting on a rock in the middle of a river in Ajunque in Puerto Rico with her parents. Every single thing went back to that, wanting to experience nature, wanting to share that joy of nature with other people. So, as I said, I just started a new role, and in many ways, this is a great example of that, all paths leading to my why. I have been obsessed with birds since I was a very, very small child. And so I'm really excited that this week I have officially returned to my home, which is in birds, and am starting as the Avian Conservation Programs Manager at VII Miami, as Melanie and Desmond mentioned. So I'd be really happy to talk more about that and the role there once I actually know exactly what I'm doing. But for right now, it looks like really working with our partners across Latin America and the Caribbean to conserve birds in their habitats, and also developing research projects in South Florida to help connect our local South Florida communities to nature and to birds and the power of birds in our backyards. So with that, I'd just like to say thank you so much. I don't know how much time exactly we have for questions, but I'd be happy to take questions. And here's a few different places that you can reach me and connect with me if you have any follow-ups or want to collaborate. And I'd be really eager to hear from you all. I'll leave this on the screen for a few moments so people can jot information down if you want to.
Okay, very good. Melanie, you want to start with a response?
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much, Dr. Munguia. I think, it's been a minute since I've been in my doctoral program, and everything you said, especially about the, like saying yes to opportunities, like if it feels like play to you, if it feels like it would be fun, then saying yes to those, because it's not actually going to take away time from your studies or detract from your progress. If it feels like it's aligned with you, right? If there's somebody that you want to work on a project with, or a board that you're interested in, an organization you're interested in, then say yes to that, because I agree with you. That's where you're going to get your fuel. It's going to help you remember your why and keep you going when it gets really hard. But also so much learning happens in those sort of auxiliary spaces that maybe aren't the library or your research, or, maybe not part of your concept paper you thought, but if it feels fun, if it speaks to you on the inside, then, follow that call and go with it, because good things will come from it. So I love that you shared that. You brought up some memories for me and also, and also times of times that maybe I should have said yes, or, and didn't, because I thought that I had to turn something in on a certain date or keep to my own deadlines or whatever. So yeah, keeping it true to your why and your calling will help. Thank you so much for that.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you so much, Stephanie. I have a lot to say, but first want to say, is this an original statement that all power should lead to your why? Because I need to give you
I think
credit.
so.
Okay, so when I use it, I'll give you credit for it because that is really, really a powerful statement there. So many different things I'm impressed with in your presentation. You're a great communicator. Before I forget, I don't know, are you aware of Birds Caribbean? I'm pretty sure you probably are.
I
Okay.
am, yeah. Looking forward to collaborating with them more in this role too.
Okay, good, good, good. So I want to actually give you a name. I think the name Environmental Prodigy, because I was really impressed with the fact that you started early. You said, if I remember correctly, that you were doing stuff from middle school and you sung like you were making a curriculum while you were in middle school. Who does that? I mean, like,
I was a weird child.
yeah, that's like really amazing for college student, in fact, to be thinking about a topic in the framework of creating a curriculum. So yeah, I think environmental prodigy at least would fit you well. Along
I'm
with that,
flattered.
yes, along with that though, I see too that there was a sense, again, early on, that you were self-assured. You were telling your teachers what you wanted to do. You were like mission focused, you were strategic. And in your first semester in college, you did research. Did you do research almost every year in college?
Yep, once I started my freshman year, I did not stop.
Yeah. So these are all, I mean, the word or the phrase role model, is kind of beaten to death. But what you did and what you described that you did is exactly what any student starting from middle school should be doing. Um, and definitely, I've tried to encourage students coming in the freshman year and as high school students to start getting involved in research, but also you add in not just research, but like getting the real world experiences. So don't, leave one, do one without the other. That's another thing I saw in your story is you combine the academic with the real world stuff. So yeah, this was really good. I have more to say, but let's open it up for other persons to ask questions and make comments as well. Anybody wants to unmute or have your hand up and
Oh, Desmond, I'll say something.
okay.
You were right about, well, first of all, I really enjoyed the segment series, but she made me think when she was speaking that it wasn't even really about the environment, but it was because she was personal. It wasn't about science and jobs and careers. She gave so many life skill training tips to us
Mhm,
and a
mhm.
roadmap to us and how to move forward in everyday life. And I really enjoyed it. I actually started taking notes and then I stopped because I just wanted to focus on everything she was saying. And then when you just shared about her being an environmental prodigy, it made me think of you, Dr. Murray. I didn't grow up with you, but I've come to know you. I mean, he was a little kid out there dissecting insects on the sidewalk growing up, but he loved
Right.
it. Like, ugh, probably if I'd known him then, I probably wouldn't be around him now. I don't know, but you know, but it actually quenched his thirst and it had him exploring at such a young age about everything. And that's what I heard from our speaker as well. And it made me think about why you started Best Early, building excellence in science and technology, but it was advocating for early participation because she is a prime example of what that stands for, what it means, and what can happen if you do advocate for early participation. Um, as a 10th grader, she said, or was she 10? I forget, but she's
In middle
remarkable.
school,
And
I know, I know.
in middle school, she's remarkable. And thank you for the life skill lessons that you taught us, as well as the other things you shared. I enjoyed it.
Yeah, she reminds me too of another speaker that we had a couple of years ago now. Kizzy Corbett is her name, and she helped develop the COVID vaccine when she was working with who was it at NIH. Her early experiences are similar. Like she enjoyed math and science, but more than that, she found opportunities and got opportunities to do research from high school. And she did that almost every year from high school through to college. So yeah, this is I think a recipe for persons who want to really get into a specific area is to combine your academics, don't forget it, but do like real life, real world experiences with it. Anybody else? Or if Steffanie or Melanie wants to comment on that. One thing I also wrote down is the question, do you sleep? Well, Steffanie,
Gotten much better at that, I will say. The time management skills really help for that.
okay. Okay. Anybody else wants to chime in? So a specific thing you mentioned was carbon markets. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Sure, yeah. So in the case of the research that I was doing, I was specifically looking at blue carbon, which is carbon that is sequestered in coastal and tidally influenced systems. So it's primarily mangroves, salt marshes, and seagrass, although some carbon is also sequestered in corals and reef building corals because they obviously need carbon to create calcium carbonate. So there are now entire market mechanisms for companies, for nonprofits, for communities to be able to invest directly in replanting or supporting restoration of those habitats, and they can get compensated for that work because obviously carbon has a price, several different pricing mechanisms, but it has a price of some form that has been put on it by either regional or national or international markets. So there's a lot of enthusiasm now around paying communities to do restoration or to protect habitats like mangrove habitats, coastal habitats that have a high pressure for development. So a lot of the Caribbean coastline, as I mentioned, experiences high development pressure. So the thought is that it's valuable to keep that carbon in the ground by keeping those ecosystems healthy and keeping them removing carbon from the atmosphere, and that is more valuable than the development. But obviously, if there isn't actual money attached to that restoration, the development will almost always win out because money is king in a lot of places. So yeah, I was looking at specifically mangroves and how extensive they are across the Caribbean, and also how reliable they are in many cases as a carbon sink, as an argument for using blue carbon as a way of financing, developing more protected areas and conserved wetland habitat, and being able to finance it that way instead of governments always perceiving it as an additional line item that they have to fund from their budget somehow.
Right. And so part of the context also for everyone to understand is that there is a enormous amount of carbon dioxide being emitted every year. And what you are referring to in terms of the word sequestration is efforts to remove the carbon dioxide from the air. And so one of the
Exactly.
ways that the ocean, for example, does that is there's a reaction between carbon dioxide and water to first form bicarbonates, which an example of a bicarbonate is baking soda, and then also to go further and react to form carbonates like calcium carbonate. So those are ways that nature is trying to compensate for all of this. I mean, it's like billions of tons of carbon dioxide every
Yeah.
single year, and it's a threat. It affects climate change. So, guess part of what you're saying when you say blue carbon markets, you're talking about things having to do with the ocean and water and stuff, right? The
Yeah,
coastline.
with coastal systems, because there's much more developed carbon markets in like terrestrial forests. So that's been a key way of conserving the Amazon rainforest for some time. For example, has been investing in planting more trees and preventing deforestation through carbon markets through there's a program called RED and RED Plus, REDD, that's been promoted by the UN for many, many years. So blue carbon sort of builds on that that argument and applies it to coastal systems, which in many cases are actually more effective at sequestering carbon, things like mangroves and salt marshes and seagrass, because they're in a system that is so unstable in many ways. They're exposed to wave action, they're exposed to hurricanes in the Caribbean. They're actually very fast growing, which means that they take up carbon much more quickly than old growth forests in the Amazon might, for example. So they're even more effective at locking away that carbon.
And so your research found that there is a threat in the Caribbean, and I'm assuming other places, to these mangroves, and consequently a threat to helping us control, or at least to some degree mitigate, because I mean, you know, billions of tons of carbon dioxide is a huge, huge problem. And
Yeah.
there are technological, I actually had a student talk about this technological research and advances in terms of trying to remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. But I'm a little bit, like you said, you're skeptical. I forget the phrase you used, but I'm kind of skeptical about the impact that these technologies, because the problem is so big. And you know, I I saw this the student was talking about 500 500,000, 500,000 tons of carbon dioxide per year. And I'm like, compared to billions, that's, not going to make even a dent. But anyway.
Yeah, it's definitely something that I think the energy around carbon markets and forest carbon markets is coming from a place of understanding that there's a lot of kind of financial and governmental interest right now backing climate mitigation and adaptation strategies. But for those of us who are actually concerned with biodiversity, there isn't as much. So there's lots of different ways that we could pull carbon out of the atmosphere. And in my mind, I kind of see them as two primary tracks. We can do that with gray infrastructure. So we could build direct air capture systems, make concrete using carbon dioxide pulled out of the atmosphere, and essentially create bigger problems than we already have by continuing to build up the human-made landscape. Or we could use green infrastructure. And then not only are we helping to draw down carbon dioxide, certainly it's not the only thing we have to do. We have to stop emitting carbon dioxide as much as possible. But we can draw down carbon dioxide by replanting native landscapes and systems that are going to have lots of additional co-benefits, cultural benefits. They're going to help support biodiversity and make sure that we're able to sustain more than just human life. So I think that's really where more of that energy comes from. It's not just about this is certainly not the solution to climate change. There's much more that needs to happen to resolve that issue, but it is a good mechanism for bringing money to biodiversity conservation, which for so long has been ignored and kind of left as a second-class concern.
Yes. So thank you so very much. If there are no other questions or comments, I think this was a really, really good episode to end season 7 on. And I'm going to leave everyone with the words of Steffanie Munguia, all paths. This is not just for students. This is for all of us. All paths should lead to your why. All paths should lead to your why. Great way to end our season 7. Thank you so much, Steffanie. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, all of you who are regulars on our Environmental Fridays. Huda, Imam, Ayman, Princess, Sylvia, Ellis, Laura. Thank you all so much. Happy holidays, and we'll see you back next year, January 10th. Take care, everyone.
Thank you, Dr. Murray.
All right.
Thank you. It's okay.
Okay.